The sound of her palm against my cheek was so loud it swallowed the whole room. My ears rang before the sting even reached me, and my 5-month-old son, still strapped against my chest in his wrap, jolted awake and let out a cry that cracked something open in me I didn't know was still whole. Dinner was 3 minutes late. 3 minutes. That was the reason. And my husband, the man who had promised to stand beside me for the rest of my life, didn't move toward me. He raised his voice louder than his own mother's slap and called me useless in front of 12 dinner guests who all sat frozen, wine glasses in hand, watching a woman get struck in her own kitchen and saying absolutely nothing. Not one person at that table reached for me. Not one person asked if I was all right. In that single silent moment, with my baby's small fist curling into my shirt like he was trying to hold on to me tighter than anyone else in that house ever would, I understood something I had spent 3 years refusing to see. That was the night I stopped being their punching bag. And it was the night I quietly began building an exit so devastating, so complete, that by the time they realized what I had been doing behind their backs, there would be nothing left for them to save. My name is Sablethorn, and 3 years before that dinner, I believed I had found the kind of love people write songs about. Weston Hale walked into the little coffee shop where I worked back in Savannah, ordered a black coffee he barely touched, and told me my laugh was the best sound he'd heard all week. He had that easy, unhurried charm that made you feel like the only person in the room, the kind of man who remembered exactly how you took your coffee after a single visit, who showed up with flowers for no reason at all. What I did not understand yet, what I would only come to understand years too late, was that Weston's charm had always had an audience of exactly one. His mother, Karen Hale, had raised him alone after his father walked out when Weston was 8 years old, and she wore that sacrifice like a suit of armor she expected the rest of the world, especially me, to bow beneath without ever daring to ask a question. When Weston proposed on a quiet pier overlooking the marsh, the sky bruised pink at the edges, I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. 6 months later we moved into the Hale family home, a manicured house in a quiet Charleston suburb that Karen still owned, still controlled down to which cabinet held the good dishes and which chair at the table was mine to occupy and no other. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a lot of things back then that I now understand were simply lies dressed up as hope, the kind of lies a hopeful young wife tells herself when she wants so badly for a house to become a home. Would I have left sooner if I'd known how long temporary could stretch? The first year, Karen's comments were small enough to swallow. The way I folded towels was wrong. The way I seasoned chicken was somehow an insult to a family recipe she never once actually shared with me, only referenced whenever she wanted to remind me I would never measure up to it. She would sigh when I walked into a room, a long, theatrical sigh that said everything without saying a single word, so that if I ever dared to call her out on it, she could simply blink at me and say, "I didn't say anything, Sable, you're imagining things." Weston noticed. Of course he noticed. But every single time I brought it up, he would rub the back of his neck the same tired way and say the same tired sentence. "That's just how she is. She means well, deep down." I started to believe I was the problem. I started to believe I was too sensitive, that I simply needed to try harder to earn a place in a family that had decided long before I ever arrived that there wasn't room for me at all. How many nights did I lie awake rehearsing apologies for things I hadn't even done? Our wedding day comes back to me now with a strange, sharp clarity. The way you remember a warning sign you drove straight past without slowing down. Karen chose the venue, the caterer, even the color of the tablecloths, all under the gentle guise of helping since I didn't have a mother of my own to plan things with. Mine had passed when I was 22, a fact Karen knew and occasionally used like a blade wrapped in velvet to remind me how fortunate I was that she had stepped in. At the reception she gave a toast that spent 4 full minutes praising Weston's every accomplishment and 30 seconds acknowledging me by name, almost as an afterthought, before pivoting straight back into a story about Weston as a little boy. I laughed along with everyone else that night. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I was already practicing, without realizing it, the exact skill that would keep me trapped in that house for 3 long years, making myself smaller so everyone around me could stay comfortable. Then I got pregnant, and for a few fragile months I let myself believe things might actually shift. I thought a baby would soften Karen. I thought watching her son become a father might finally give her a reason to see me as something more than an intruder living under her roof. I was wrong in a way that still tightens my chest whenever I let myself remember it. Reese was born that spring, 5 months before the dinner that changed everything, and from the moment we carried him through the front door, Karen treated my son as though he belonged to her and had merely passed through me on his way there. She rearranged his nursery 3 separate times without asking. She introduced him to her friends at church as my grandson, without once mentioning my name in the same breath. And the exhaustion of new motherhood, the sleepless nights, the healing body, the thick fog that swallows a person whole in those first months, became in Karen's eyes just more proof that I wasn't capable of running her household the way she demanded it be run. Weston's promotion never came through. Instead, he leaned harder into late nights at the office, coming home well past dinner, saying less and less, letting his mother fill every silence he left behind him like water rushing to fill a cracked vessel. I started to feel like a guest worker inside someone else's life, expected to cook, to clean, to soothe a colicky newborn, and somehow also anticipate Karen's moods before she'd even step through the front door. There is one smaller moment, weeks before that dinner, that I still think about often. Reese had a fever one night, and I asked Weston to watch him so I could shower for the first time in 2 days. Karen overheard and told her son not to bother, that new mothers simply have to push through it. And Weston, without even glancing my way, agreed with her. I stood in that hallway holding my crying, feverish son, and I understood quietly, privately, that if I ever truly needed protection in that house, it was never going to come from him. What does it do to a woman's heart, learning that lesson while holding a sick baby alone in a dark hallway? Around that same time, Karen began a habit I did not fully understand until much later. She started hosting small afternoon gatherings with her closest friends while Weston was still at work, timed for whenever I'd finally gotten Reese down for his one reliable nap of the day. She would ask me to bring out coffee and pastries, introduce me to her guests almost as an afterthought, and steer the conversation toward how hard it is to find good help these days, laughing lightly as though it were a joke I was meant to be in on. I would stand there holding a tray, smiling because I didn't know what else to do, while a room full of strangers nodded along like I wasn't standing 3 feet away hearing every word. It took me longer than it should have to understand what those afternoons truly were. Karen wasn't just venting. She was quietly building a narrative among the people whose opinions mattered most to her, laying groundwork 1 coffee hour at a time, so that if I ever left, or if anyone ever questioned how she treated me, there would already be a room full of witnesses ready to agree I had simply never been capable enough to appreciate everything she'd done for me. Was she already preparing her defense before she'd even thrown the first punch? The dinner that changed everything was supposed to be a celebration. Weston's sister was visiting from out of state with her husband, and Karen had invited half the neighborhood. The kind of gathering where she could parade her son's beautiful family around like a trophy she'd personally polished for display. I had been up since 5 that morning with Reese, who'd caught a cold and cried through most of the night. I made the roast, the sides, and bread from scratch, because Karen had made it clear months earlier that store-bought bread wasn't acceptable in her house. I carried Reese in his wrap because he wouldn't settle in the bassinet, and I was exactly 3 minutes behind Karen's rigid dinner schedule when I finally set the last dish on the table. She didn't yell first. She crossed the kitchen in 4 fast, deliberate steps, and her palm connected with my cheek so hard the entire room went silent before the sting even registered. Reese jolted against my chest and began to wail. My hand flew up instinctively to cradle the back of his head, to shield him from whatever came next. And in that moment, with my son crying and my face burning, I looked straight at Weston. I needed him to move, to step between us, to say anything at all that told every single person in that room whose side he was truly on. Instead, he raised his voice, not at his mother, but at me. He said I had embarrassed the family by being late. He said I made everything harder than it needed to be. He glanced at his mother, then back at me, and the word useless left his mouth like it was nothing, like it hadn't just detonated 3 years of everything I thought I understood about the man I married. Nobody at that table said a word in my defense. Not his sister, not her husband, not the neighbors who had been drinking Karen's wine for the better part of an hour. I stood there with my crying son in my arms, my cheek throbbing, and I understood with total, terrible clarity that I had spent 3 years trying to earn a place at a table that was never, under any circumstances, going to make room for me. I didn't cry in front of them. I want to be clear about that, Because for a long time crying was the only power I thought I had left, and that night I decided I would not hand them the satisfaction of watching me break in front of an audience. I excused myself, carried Reese upstairs, fed him, rocked him until his little body finally went slack with sleep, and sat in the dark nursery long after the guests had gone home and the house had gone quiet. That was the night the fog finally lifted. Not because of the slap alone, bruises fade, and mine did too eventually. It was the silence afterward, the fact that not one single person in that house saw me as someone worth protecting, that told me everything I needed to know about my future there. But what none of them knew, none of them, was that I hadn't been quiet these past few months out of weakness. I had been quiet because I was paying very, very close attention. 3 weeks before that dinner, I'd been digging through a filing cabinet in the study, searching for Reese's insurance card, when I found a folder tucked behind a stack of old tax returns, left unlocked, probably because no one in that house ever imagined I would go looking through anything that wasn't mine to touch. Inside were bank statements and correspondence that simply didn't add up. Over the following days, in stolen quiet moments, I pieced together more of the picture. Karen had been borrowing against a trust set up in Weston's name by his late grandfather, a trust meant to activate fully when Weston turned 35, only 4 months away. She had been quietly moving funds for over a year into a business venture with a financial advisor whose name I didn't recognize from anywhere legitimate. Weston had no idea. He trusted his mother with everything, including the one asset that was supposed to be his safety net. I said nothing that night, or the night of the dinner, or in the days that followed. I photographed every page I could find. I mailed copies to a private post office box I had quietly opened under my maiden name months earlier, back when the sighs and the backhanded comments first started making me feel like I needed an exit plan of my own. I told myself at the time it was just in case. I didn't know yet how right that instinct would turn out to be. The morning after the slap, I did something Karen never expected. I got up early, packed a bag for myself and Reese, and drove 2 hours to my sister's house in Columbia. I didn't slam a single door on my way out. I didn't scream. I left one note on the kitchen counter that said only, "I need space to think about what happened last night." No accusations, no threats, just enough to make them wonder. Weston called 11 times that first day. Karen called twice, both times leaving voicemails insisting I was overreacting, that she had barely touched me. I saved every single one of those voicemails without answering. While staying at my sister's, going through old boxes I'd left in her garage before the wedding, I found something I had genuinely forgotten I still had, a stack of old emails from years earlier, from a brief period when Weston had been communicating with a woman named Odette, someone he'd described at the time as just a friend from college. Reading them again with new eyes, I noticed a single line I had missed the first time. He'd told her his mother runs a tight ship, but that you learn to work around her instead of fighting her. He had known, even back then, exactly what Karen was capable of. He had simply chosen, for 3 straight years, to let it happen to me instead of ever standing in the way of it. That discovery didn't make me angrier. It made me calmer. It confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. Weston wasn't a bystander in his mother's behavior. He had made peace with it long before I ever entered the picture, and he had simply expected me to make peace with it too. What do you do when you realize the man you married chose comfort over you before you ever said your vows? While I was still deciding what came next, I got a call I never expected, from Weston's sister Marguerite, the one who had sat silently at that table while her mother struck me. I almost didn't answer. When I finally did, she didn't apologize right away, and honestly, I respected her more for that than if she had. She asked if she could come see me, and 2 days later she sat across from me at my sister's kitchen table and told me something I hadn't known, that she'd grown up watching her mother do smaller versions of the exact same thing to her own father before he left, and that she had spent years convincing herself it was normal, that families were simply loud and controlling and difficult, and that anyone who left had simply never tried hard enough. Watching Karen strike me with Reese still on my chest, she said, was the first time she had ever seen the pattern clearly from the outside instead of from within it. Marguerite didn't ask me to forgive her mother, and she didn't ask me to come back. She only asked if there was anything she could do to help. I told her the truth, that I didn't need her to fight my battles, but that if she was ever asked directly what she had seen that night, I needed her to tell the truth instead of protecting the family's image the way everyone else in that house had trained themselves to do. She agreed. And months later, when it mattered most, she kept that promise. I made 3 appointments that first week. The first was with a family law attorney named Priscilla Vaughan, sharp and unbothered, who listened to my entire story without once interrupting and then laid out exactly what documentation I'd need to secure a custody arrangement that protected Reese. The second was with a financial forensics consultant, a quiet, methodical man who spent the following weeks combing carefully through everything I'd photographed, and who came back with a preliminary assessment identifying several serious irregularities. Enough, he said, to warrant a full formal investigation once the trust's other named trustee was brought into the picture. The third appointment was the one that mattered most, a meeting with Weston's estranged uncle, Desmond Hale, his late grandfather's younger brother and the trust's actual co-trustee, a man Karen had spent years keeping at arm's length precisely because he was the one person who could hold her accountable for anything at all. I sent Desmond copies of everything I had, not with a note demanding revenge, just a simple message. I think you should see this before the trust activates. Weston finally tracked me down at my sister's a week later, showing up unannounced, full of apologies that arrived far too late and sounded rehearsed rather than felt. He said his mother didn't mean it that way. He said he'd been under pressure at work and shouldn't have raised his voice. He asked when I was coming home, as if home was still a word that honestly applied to that house anymore. I told him about the trust. I watched the color drain out of his face in real time. He hadn't known the specifics. I believe that much was true. But what struck me more than his shock was what came right after it, not concern for what his mother had actually done, but a desperate, immediate need to control how bad it was all going to look. We can fix this quietly, he said. We don't need to involve lawyers. We definitely don't need to involve Uncle Desmond. Even standing there, faced with real proof of his own mother's dishonesty, his first instinct was damage control for the family image, not accountability, and not protection for the woman and child she had struck under his own roof only a week before. That was the moment I stopped waiting for Weston to become the man I had needed him to be all along. Some people show you exactly who they are in the smallest decisions, a raised voice at the wrong moment, a refusal to step between you and harm, a scramble to protect a reputation instead of a family. I finally let myself believe what I had been watching for 3 years, instead of what I had been hoping for the whole time. But would the truth be enough to hold Karen accountable, or would her carefully built image protect her one more time? In the days that followed, Karen tried an entirely different approach. She called my sister directly, insisting there had been a misunderstanding, offering to pay for a family counselor if I would only sit down with her one more time. When that didn't work, she showed up at my sister's workplace unannounced, standing in the parking lot until security asked her to leave. It was a strange thing to witness, a woman who had spent years controlling every room she walked into, suddenly discovering that none of her usual tools worked on someone who had simply stopped showing up to be controlled. I didn't respond to any of it. I let my attorney handle every message that came in after that, and slowly the calls and the visits stopped altogether. The trust investigation stretched across several months. Desmond, who had every legal right and every financial motivation to dig once he saw the documentation, brought in his own attorneys and his own accountant. The mismanagement turned out to be extensive, enough that Karen was ultimately required to repay a significant portion of the misappropriated funds from her own personal assets, and enough that the unlicensed advisor she had been working with was formally reported to state regulators for operating without proper licensure. Karen's carefully maintained image, the one she had spent years polishing at dinner parties and church functions and neighborhood gatherings, cracked wide open in a matter of weeks. Friends who once filled her dining room every Sunday stopped calling. The community she had built her entire identity around began to quietly, permanently pull away from her. I never once had to raise my voice through any of it. I never had to scream or beg or throw a single accusation across a room. I simply told the truth at the right time to the right person, and let the consequences that already existed inside that family's own dishonesty do what they were always eventually going to do on their own. I attended one part of the proceedings in person, the day Desmond's attorney laid out the full timeline of the transfers in front of a mediator. Karen sat across the room in a pale blue blazer, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the same posture she used to hold at the head of her own dinner table. She never once looked at me. When Marguerite was asked what she remembered from the night of the dinner, she answered plainly, without flinching, without softening it for her mother's sake, the way I once assumed she always would. I watched something shift in Karen's expression when her own daughter's testimony matched mine exactly, detail for detail. For the first time since I had known her, she looked less like a woman in control of a room and more like a woman finally watching the room close in around her instead. The custody arrangement finalized several months later. I retained primary physical custody of Reese, and the parenting schedule was built with clear, documented boundaries around Weston's time with our son, including specific conditions limiting Karen's presence during those visits, given everything that had come out about that household. I moved into a small house of my own outside Columbia, close enough to my sister that I never had to face a difficult night completely alone again. I finished the associate's degree I had paused when I got pregnant, and I started working toward the career I had shelved the moment I decided Weston's family needed to come first, always, no matter the cost to myself. Reese is walking now. He has my laugh, not Karen's tight-lipped smile, not Weston's practiced charm. And when he cries, I am the one who comes running every single time, without a moment of hesitation. I heard secondhand that Karen moved out of the family home entirely, the financial fallout from the trust settlement making it impossible for her to manage alone. I heard Weston's promotion finally came through, months too late to matter to a marriage that was already over long before it ever landed on his desk. I don't know if either of them thinks about that dinner the way I still do sometimes. I don't know if Karen understands, even now, that the moment her hand met my face was the exact moment she lost every ounce of power she thought she still had over me. There was no apology I ever needed to accept, because none worth accepting ever actually came. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic final scene where I told them everything I thought of them. Justice, I learned the hard way, doesn't always look like a shouting match. Sometimes it looks like quietly gathering the truth while everyone around you assumes your silence means surrender. Sometimes it looks like walking away with your son on your hip, and never once looking back to see if they're watching you go. Marguerite and I still talk, more often than I ever expected we would. She sends photos of her own daughter sometimes, and every so often she tells me, almost like she's still working through it herself, that watching me leave gave her the courage to finally start setting her own boundaries with Karen too. I never asked her to choose a side that night at my sister's kitchen table. She chose one anyway, and I think some part of her needed to as much as I needed her to. As for Weston, the last real conversation we ever had wasn't an argument. It was quieter than that, almost businesslike, the two of us signing papers across a conference table while our attorneys reviewed the final terms. He asked, right before we finished, whether things could have gone differently if he had just stepped in that one night at dinner. I told him the truth, that one night was never really the problem. The problem was every quiet moment before it, every sigh I was told to ignore, every time he chose comfort over defending the people who needed him most. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there ever was one to give. I built a life they are no longer part of, one quiet decision at a time. And every single morning, I wake up in a house where no one raises a hand or a voice against me. I understand now, more clearly than I ever could have back then, that leaving wasn't the ending of my story. It was only the very beginning of it. So I have to ask you this. If someone raised their hand against you in your own home, and the person who was supposed to protect you stayed silent instead, how long would you have stayed before you finally chose yourself?